Welcome everyone. All right, I see the participant numbers ticking up. More and more people are joining. Welcome. Hope y'all are having a really wonderful Friday, but everyone's glad to get to Friday. It seems something to look forward to now more than ever. So hopefully everyone has a nice glass of something in their in your hands. And well, hello, David in Nebraska. I see everyone's starting to use the chat. Please do. We loved that last week, so we're really excited to see where everyone's calling in from and what you're eating during all of this. That's always fun to hear too. So for those of you who I haven't met, I'm Megan. I'll be co-hosting this tasting with Mike today, and we're just so delighted that you all joined us. We were completely blown away and amazed, frankly, at how many folks joined us last time, and we're glad that this is interesting to folks. So I hope you're looking forward to today. We are really excited to talk about Zinfandel. But before we jump in, there's somebody who wants to say a special hello to everybody. So I'm going to move aside here and give 6 feet of social distancing space to the one and only George Hendry. Hey, George. Applause everywhere, I'm sure.
Hi there, folks. I just wanted to welcome you all to this virtual wine tasting, and basically let you know that we are doing well here. We're very fortunate in that we're able to, all of our employees are at work in both the vineyard and the winery producing this product, and we're especially appreciative to Angela and Megan and Tamara and Therese that are all supporting all those nice orders that you guys are sending in, and we especially are appreciative to you because you're sending in the orders that actually keep this operation working, and that is very important. So thank you all.
Thanks, George. We'll see you soon, I'm sure. And we're hoping to, do more, as we said last week, on social media, little interviews with George and others here. So, and now welcome Mike. Hey, Mike. We feel like we're especially, we heard many of you last time said that the audio wasn't great, so we have this new microphone. So now I really feel like we're hosting the 5 o'clock news. We've got guest segments and everything, so. This
new gigantic microphone. And actually, the first thing we're gonna do is sing for you with this, right? So, no, just kidding.
You're horrifying.
So I think we would all prefer to be sitting down face to face, but this has some positives as well. And at the same time, we can taste with people who are as close as our neighbors or as far away as Okotoks, Alberta, or Oslo, Norway. So thank you for joining us. This is the second topic, which is really Zinfandel. And I thought this was going to be the easy one, but the more time I spent on it, the more complicated it got. But Zinfandel is a very, it's sort of a unique story for us, and anyone who knows Hendry also knows that Zinfandel is a very important part of what we do. It's the only grape variety that we've been growing here all 81 years on this property.
And if I can real quick, just to tell you guys a little bit about how we're going to do today, or how we're going to structure today. As Mike said, it is a pretty sort of historic grape here on the property as well as in California. So we thought we'd start with some of that higher level history, going all the way back to before it came to California, talk about it a little bit here on the Hendry Ranch, and then the particular spots where we're growing it here, kind of what's unique about those and the wines that come out of them. And then we thought we would jump in and compare the 2 Zinfandels that we have currently from 2016, talk a little bit about some tasting experiments we've done here, and then we'll of course, we have a couple of other topics. We've got a bonus wine today that we're going to throw in there. And so we of course want questions along the way. So please, you see the Q&A button down there at the bottom of your screen, as well as the chat. So we have many questions that you sent in advance. We're going to try and cover those, but please keep them coming as we do this. But without further ado, let's jump in.
Great. So Zinfandel really, it's not an American grape, but it is an American name. And the name Zinfandel first appeared in Megan's old stomping grounds in the Boston area in the 1830s. And at that time, horticulture and raising grapes in greenhouses was a pretty big business. And as any grape sampler can tell you Zinfandel is a delicious grape. And at the time, people were shifting the ripening cycle of the grape and having fresh fruit for sale in the spring. And apparently it was pretty profitable. Zinfandel, when it came to California in the early 1850s, fairly quickly became an important wine grape. But an important thing about California in the 1850s, that the gold rush here was 1849. There was a lot of settlement in the 1850s. There was a lot going on. And even though there was a wine industry and a history of growing Vitis vinifera grapes that was almost 100 years old at that point, that grape was almost exclusively mission, or what we call the mission variety. And people were looking for new things to plant and new things to grow. And I think sort of oddly, for many California viticulturists at that time, Zinfandel was sort of viewed almost as an East Coast variety and less of a European one. So it started, it caught on, it got noticed as a wine grape, but it wasn't until the 1880s that it actually became an important wine grape. And then it became the wine grape. And in Napa and Sonoma in particular, almost all of the plantings starting around 1880 were Zinfandel. So between 1878 and 1881 in Napa, the vineyard acreage almost tripled, and almost all of that planting was Zinfandel. In the Sonoma County, in the Healdsburg, Dry Creek area, almost 80% of the plantings in the 1880s were Zinfandel. So it was sort of the thing, and it was kind of the, it was to these growing regions what Cabernet has been in the last several years, or 20 years or so. So it was in that time frame, that the 1880s, that really Zinfandel became established as one of California's iconic grapes.
And was that, so if we go back to what the now Hendry Ranch was like back then, was it on the property at that time before your grandparents bought it?
We don't actually know.
Okay.
I don't know. And we do know that all of the vineyard property we have was planted by 1880. We do know that most of that was the mission grape. Also maybe the first person to grow Zinfandel. Certainly the first person in this area was Osborne, and his ranch was just a few miles from here. So it's likely that there was some Zinfandel here at that time, although I'm not sure.
Do you know when it was first planted here?
No.
Okay. But by the time your grandparents bought it, if I remember correctly, there was some Zinfandel?
There was, but I'd like to go, before we talk about that, I'd like to talk a little more about Zinfandel and sort of what the grape is, and go back to Europe and what we now know.
And if you have a Zinfandel, by the way, please start drinking. Don't wait for us. We'll get there.
This is true. These are empty glasses.
Last time someone said you guys didn't do a lot of tasting for a tasting, so we're going to remedy that this time. But please, dive in.
So what we learned, and this Zinfandel name was sort of unique to America anyway, and as a wine, it became something that was known in California, but no one knew where it had come from before that. And in the 1960s, a professor from UC Davis, using the genetic tools of the day, really determined that Primitivo in Italy was the same variety as Zinfandel here. And looking at the history of Italian grape growing, it doesn't actually look like Primitivo has been there much longer than Zinfandel has been in California. So that eventually led to an extended search for the origins of Zinfandel in Croatia, across the Adriatic from Italy. And that turned up vines that go by a few different names that were also Zinfandel. So it turns out eventually, with the genetic tools that we now have, that Zinfandel is a very old variety. I think there are some people who even argue that it's one of the oldest varieties that we grow to any great extent. I don't know how true that is, but I have heard that. But it is, the history here is unique in terms of the way that it became an important grape without any really earlier history to rely on. But it does turn out to be an old grape.
That's interesting. Does it make sense to talk about now, like how it ended up here and the history of it on the Hendry Ranch? Because I do think that it's something that we are known for. It's been something that we've been known for a while. So
Right.
What kind of role does it play on our property?
Well, when my grandparents bought this property in 1939, what was here at that time was a 6-acre vineyard that was a mixed variety, field blended Zinfandel vineyard, essentially. And that's the vineyard that my dad and my uncle both grew up with here. That the vineyard that we had was expanded a little bit to Golden Chasselas by my grandmother. And then in the 70s, when Napa really was sort of, again, finding its footing in terms of grapevine plantings, there were a couple of important things that happened before that. With the big expansions of plantings in the 1880s, that was really followed by an insect pest, phylloxera, and then prohibition, and then depression. So when Napa recovered from that, the wine industry was much smaller than it had been. And when my grandparents bought this property, even though it had all been planted in the past, that 6-acre vineyard was all that was left. And then really, again, as I said, in the 70s, grapes again became the thing, and George replanted most of this property to vineyard then. And he asked about what to plant, and the advice of the day, it seems strange knowing what we know now, but this part of the valley was considered too cool to grow things like Cabernet. And George knew that Zinfandel worked here. It always had. So he planted about 50 acres of Zinfandel at that time. 40 of those acres were grafted subsequently to Chardonnay and Cabernet, but the vineyard that remained in Zinfandel was our Block 7, and that's a 9-acre vineyard, and most of those vines that were planted in 1975 still remain. And it's, as you know, an important part of this is not the new label, but it's meant to help with the video, but it's still the most important part of that Zinfandel that we bought. So.
Yeah, and I think people who have been with us a long time too remember when it was just Block 7 before we started blending it with 22, before Block 28 came along. So I think it'd be interesting to hear a little bit about, what makes those different blocks unique, or ways in which they're similar, and maybe some of the history of winemaking and how these came to be blended.
Right.
In the way that they are.
So prior to 1992, all of the fruit that we grew, we sold ourselves. And all the fruit we grew, we sold. We didn't make any wine. George started the Hendry Winery in 1992. And the only exception to the estate fruit that we've grown here was in the early 90s. And in the early 90s, we leased and farmed an old Zinfandel vineyard on Mount Veeder that belonged to the Brandlin family. And the Brandlins, it's a beautiful vineyard. It's a fantastic spot. The Brandlins were old family friends of my grandparents. So in the first vintage of the Hendry label, we had a Brandlin Zinfandel and a Hendry Zinfandel, and they were very different wines. And we thought, of course they are. The Brandlin vineyard at the time, it was maybe 70 years old, dry farmed, head trained. It made a very distinctive, structured style of Zinfandel that we like to compare it to Cabernet. It had those sorts of tannins at times. It had a distinctive dark fruit, that sort of anise or licorice characteristic. And then Block 7 was really lighter in personality. It was, I thought of it as really expressing red fruit typically, so that raspberry, strawberry jam kinds of things that had a caramel note and softer tannins. And Susan Ridley, who started the Hendry Winery with George, liked her adjectives for these wines were grace and power. Block 7 was grace, Block 28 was power, and people still remember that.
Well, not the Block 28, the Brandlin.
The Brandlin, excuse me,
yeah.
right? Yeah. So
and your hypothesis back then, you said, of course, you realized they were different. Was the hypothesis because they were just two completely different vineyards with fairly dramatic differences between them?
Yeah, there were many reasons why they should be different. Vine age, whatever that means, clone potentially, whatever that means. It was that vineyard's about 1,000 feet higher in elevation than we are. It had a very steep east-facing slope, dry farmed, all of those things that should contribute to these differences. And then another very important thing happened to us in the early 90s, and that was that George bought the adjoining property, which was really a continuation of the vineyard that we already had. Certainly the same bench land, and for the most part, the same soil types. So there was a lot going on there. George was very busy and productive, and I know for sure that he would have liked to buy the Brandland vineyard, but starting the winery, buying the neighboring property, and I think at a certain point he realized he couldn't buy everything. So what we did instead was take cuttings from the Brandland vineyard and graft them to Block 28. Right beside Block 28, on really essentially similar soils, was Block 22. And when those vineyards started to reach maturity, a very interesting thing happened in our minds. And the interesting thing was that they both made wines that tasted very much like where they'd come from. Block 22 was cuttings from Block 7, 28 was the Brandland cuttings. And I still remember very distinctly, it was several years after we had farmed the Brandland vineyard. We got a hold of a bottle of the wine that had been made up there, and George and I were tasting it in the winery, and one of our vineyard employees, Gonzalo, came into the winery, and he didn't have any idea what we were tasting, but we poured him a glass and of this Brandland Zinfandel without any prompting. He said it tastes like Block 28, and that very sort of crystallized for me how important this distinction was. So really what this, to summarize what we've seen, is that we've seen each of these cuttings in very different places produce similar wines, and we've seen the two of them side by side in Block 28 and Block 22 produce very different wines. And what this means is that clonal variation in Zinfandel is also very important. As we've learned more about Zinfandel, we've learned about Primitivo, we've learned that some of these clonal variation factors can be at least as important as some of these other things that we talk about. And that's really what's led to the two wines that we have today. Block 7 became Block 7 and 22 when that reached maturity, and rather than having a Brandland Zinfandel, we now have Block 28.
And so there are a couple eagle-eyed Hendry fans out there I know who've taken a look at our map, and Steve Getz out there, hi Steve, from the Bay Area, one of our longtime club members, pointed out that another winery in the Bay Area has released a Block 29, Hendry Block 29 Zinfandel. So those are not the only places on the property where we have planted Zinfandel. Have we ever used Block 29, or are there other blocks out there where we've got some Zinfandel planted on the property?
Funny you should ask. And the reason I say this, so when we were selling Zinfandel fruit, one of the wineries that was very important to us, and I think we to them, was the Rosenblum winery, and Kent Rosenblum bought our Block 7 fruit for a long time, and made a Hendry Vineyard Zinfandel, and that was really, in terms of where we sold our fruit, that was the only place where we had name recognition on the label. So Rockwall is a winery that is now run by Shauna Rosenblum, and we, for the last several years, have sold our Block 29 fruit to them, mostly because of our long-term relationship with them and our respect for what the Rosenblums have done. We haven't really made a Block 29 Zinfandel independently for several years, but this year we have. And it's an old selection from a Mendocino vineyard, and it makes a very interesting wine. I think in turn it tends to have, it's a little bit like Primitivo. If I was to distinguish what makes the Primitivo different, is that it tends to have smaller, looser clusters, and I see more of that in Block 29. Also, it tends to make a powerful concentrated wine that, at least in this case, one, we like it a lot, and two, it's different than the other Zinfandels at the moment, although it's still on a continuation of that same slope of vineyard that contains Block 22 and 28.
So maybe in a couple of years, we could do this all over again and add another one to the lineup, maybe, and
possibly, yes. In our ever proliferating family tree of wines, we may have more.
Years.
Yeah.
So that, I think, brings us to the 2016 vintage. the one that we're all currently drinking. I know some of you have it, some of you have other vintages, and we can talk a little bit about those too. But let's talk a little bit about these 2016s that we have here.
Yes, and this is where,
Cheers.
And cheers, yes. And the story got more complicated for me here. We didn't have a 2015 Block 28, so it's been a while since I've sat down and tasted these wines side by side. And in getting ready for this tasting, on Wednesday, I sat down and wanted to sort of finalize my tasting notes. And as I tasted them, I tasted them again and felt more and more like these wines actually weren't very different. So now I've told you this very clear, concise story about where these wines come from and why we make them the way we do. And as I was tasting them, I felt like, you know what, they're pretty similar. And then I forced everyone I could find in the winery into doing a blind tasting with me on this. And we all concluded that we had trouble differentiating them. And when I felt like I could differentiate them regularly, what I was focusing on was the difference in the oak treatment and really not what was coming from the fruit. So Block 7 and 22, we typically make it with about 1/3 new oak. Block 28, we typically use about 2/3 new oak, and it's really the same sorts of barrels. So that complicates the story. And it's partly, I mean, maybe it's not unexpected. It may be, I mean, I am very confident in the fact that clonal variation matters, but it may be that these vineyards continue to change with time. We backtracked and looked at the 2014 vintage, and I really feel like we saw much more of what we expected in those two right now. It may be that these clones, there are only certain years where they're very expressive in terms of these differences. So,
Yeah.
so the reason why is a little bit of a mystery, but we did conclude that, you know, that the difference between these two wines in this year is not as big as it usually is, and it's not as big as we usually make it out to be when we talk about it.
Right, and I think I couldn't quite catch the name. Someone had asked, you know, which of these would we start with? And typically, you know, and we've got here the 7 and 22. As Mike said, these are not our new labels, but over here we've got the 28. And in many years, you know, when we do tastings here at the winery, we often suggest that people start with the 7 and 22 for those reasons that Mike identified. You know, typically the tannins aren't quite as robust, and it's a little more red fruit as opposed to a little more black fruit in the Block 28. But this might be a year where, you know, start with either, or
both at the same time.
Both at the same time. I mean, quarantine rules are very different. So,
or make a blend.
Or make a blend, yeah. So we actually thought, you know, if for those of you who have both of these wines, if you want to recreate the experiment at home and see for yourself, and you can let us know, we'd be curious to hear if other people find those differences that we sort of struggled to identify this year. The way Mike set it up for all of us was, you know, we had 3 glasses and we did this blind. So if you, you know, have someone that you're quarantining with, I guess, who's willing to do this for you, you know, 2 of the glasses are poured, you know, you have the same wine poured into those 2, and then you have one that's different. And the idea is you taste through all of them and see if you can identify the one that's different, right?
So the question is find the different one. And the problem with doing that only once is that you've got a 1 in 3 chance of getting it right randomly. So if you want to be confident in the results, you need to be able to get it right at least 3 times in a row. And then you're down to you know, a few percent in terms of whether or not that was a random choice. So that's sort of the test. You still have some wine, and you don't, I mean, what I did was put a little mark on the bottom of each glass, and you can scramble them around so you don't know what they are, and then, you know, taste it and check your result and then try again. So. Yeah.
There's nothing more humbling than a blind tasting.
It's true.
To really make you think and appreciate all the work that goes into, you know, putting the wines together. But some people had asked too about sort of tasting notes for these wines and what we would be looking for. One thing that we did include in the confirmation email this time around is on our website, we've got information about all the wines. They include winemaking notes as well as wine tasting notes. Tamara always writes up some really beautiful descriptions and with some pairing suggestions in there. So those are on our website if you would like them. And if you want to do the experiment at home, I think there are lots and lots of resources online about how to do sort of systematic tastings, organized tastings where you're sort of analyzing each wine the same way. The WSET, the Court of Master Sommeliers, has a lot of that information that you can just Google. But I do think it is helpful to, make and it does not have to be detailed, but at least in your mind, maybe some little rubric that you're tasting through so you're looking for the same thing in each wine. You can look at the color, you can smell it, try and identify certain, aromatic sort of groups. I think you don't have to get real specific. I think Mike mentioned red fruit earlier. I think red fruit, black fruit is a really good distinction. Is it herbal? Is it, a non-fruit aroma? I know that I sometimes have a hard time getting, really, really, really specific, like, peach versus, nectarine. To me, those are very similar. So I don't stress too much about that. But then when you start to taste, you're looking again for those different sort of, are the sort of aromatic compounds that you identified, are you tasting those as well? What's the acidity like? That sort of mouth-watering quality you get. How are the tannins? Are you feeling those? Are you experiencing those? That kind of, slightly dry, astringent, chalky sensation. What's the alcohol like? Do you feel it? That sort of heat. And I think that, looking for those components, to me at least, was something I was doing a lot as I was trying to figure out these wines, knowing historically, how we treat the Block 28 in terms of, oak, and that it is usually the larger, or the more tannic of the two. I was, trying to focus in on those different aspects. So again, I think people have a lot of time on their hands right now, so it could be something that's kind of fun if you're a wine geek like us to experiment with that and, open up a couple bottles at a time if you want and see what you think. And again, we would really love to hear if people are finding these to be maybe more similar than they were in the past. So, yeah. Cool. So one question we get a lot, and as we had mentioned, a lot of folks said, I know Chris in Boston and Morgan and Elizabeth in Wilmington and Heather, I forget where you're from, I'm sorry. You guys are all drinking the Block 27 and 22 from 2014. And so they'd asked about how that vintage differed and what the wines were like, and can you age wine, or can you age Zinfandel? Does it age as well as some other things? So Mike, what are your thoughts on aging?
Yeah, you can definitely age Zinfandel for a long time. And some of our Zinfandels that are 20 plus years old are very beautiful right now. The fruit, I think Zinfandel, whatever direction it goes, there's always some version of ripe fruit. And as those wines age, it tends to shift more toward a dried fruit kind of fruit to me. It's sort of almost like a fruit leather kind of fruit. And the tannins soften. It can become very delicate. But I've had several 40 plus year old Zinfandels that I think are really beautiful. And recently, a number of 18, 19, 20 year old Zinfandels, including some old Brandlin stuff that was really good too.
And this is testing Mike a little bit here, but what do you remember about 2014? Are there compared to 2016? Were there major differences in those years that could be? I would need to go. I don't remember off the top of my head the weather parts of it. I do think in general that I've always resisted some of the good vintage, bad vintage stuff because I feel like we have a wide enough range of varieties that in some years, some varieties do better than others and some vineyard blocks do better than others. But 2014 is one of the years where I think sort of across the board, the red varieties were very rich and dense and I think in general quite good. Awesome. So our human teleprompter here, Angela, I forgot to mention earlier, Angela's here. She's in her corner and she's been monitoring the chat and she's got a couple questions for us here. So we'll go through those. So
can I actually want to go off topic a little bit before we get to the other questions? So
okay.
I have one more wine that's a surprise wine. And if you're like me during the discussion we had earlier, you might have wondered what Mission wine tasted like. And I wondered that for a long time. And if you pick up any sort of modern wine book, I think the story that's told is always that Mission is something that we don't grow anymore because now we know better. But it's a grape that the Spanish first brought to the Americas somewhere between 1520 and 1540. And for the next 300 years, it was really the grape. And it always seems strange to me that people stuck with it for 300 years because it was always terrible.
And they planted it, we called it Mission because it was at all the missions, right?
Right. Yeah. And within California, even by 1880, when you would consider we're well within the sort of the expansion of California viticulture, Mission was still the most widely planted variety. And when people discussed grape types, they referred to Mission and foreign varieties. So if it wasn't Mission, it was something new and foreign. And my first experience with Mission was with a bottle of wine from Baja, California in Mexico. And it was very interesting. And that got me thinking more about the history of this property and the vines that were here before what we have today, and the really Napa, Sonoma, and the rest of California. And I feel like it's a grape that we owe it to ourselves to know what it tastes like and to continue to talk about it. And Zinfandel, among many people, is considered sort of our heritage grape, but I think the history of Mission is at least as important. So it's a grape that most of these people who wrote the books and talk about how terrible it is, I feel like they've never tasted it.
There's very little left in their defense, right? To taste. So, but we're changing that.
So several years ago, I started with 80 Mission vines in 4 different clones. And we make a single barrel of Mission every year. And the last several years, this wine has sort of been something that's been sold in California into restaurants. We haven't really presented it to people before. But I've always sort of, imagined a scene in early California of people sitting in Napa watching grizzly bears catch salmon in the Napa River and sipping a glass of wine. And if they were doing that, this is the wine they were drinking. So Mission, still we make a single barrel, and we make it in the style of a still dry red wine, which I think for most of its history is really what it's been. It's a lighter wine structure-wise. It's more like I'm not a Gamay expert, but it's more like Gamay than anything else I can think of. It's not.
Yeah. It's I know we don't have our flashlight with us today, but when you look at it compared to the Zinfandel, it's definitely looks lighter, right, in terms of its color.
This is not a wine you'd have a hard time telling apart from the Zinfandel in a blind tasting. Yeah. But it's a very worthy wine. I think this is a reference that probably no one will understand, but the fruit in this, well, maybe a few people will. The fruit in this reminds me more of a berry called a Saskatoon than anything else. It's not a particularly sweet fruit, and it has a kind of a nutty character to it, like this does. I think it has a sort of a peppery overtone on the finish, but some relatively firm tannin. So it's a very interesting wine, and we're going to continue to explore it and talk about it, because I think it's the most interesting wine you've probably never heard of. So.
Right. And actually, so correct me if I'm wrong, but we, a couple months ago, went on sort of a kick trying to understand the genealogy of this one a little bit better, and sort of like Zinfandel maybe 30, 40 years ago, where, we knew it wasn't from here, but it was associated with California. We didn't know where it was from. And I think that was sort of true with Mission. We knew it came from Spain, but in terms of trying to identify the particular cultivar, and trying to find other places where it's grown, it's been a little tricky, right? We've seen it. You saw it in Baja. My understanding is there's a little bit of it on the Canary Islands.
Yes, and it sort of went everywhere that the Spanish did. I think in South America, both Chile and Argentina, they have some of it still. And it certainly grows in the Canary Islands under the name Listan Prieto, I believe.
Yeah.
And they're within California. There are still a few hundred acres, but you won't find it really made in this style very often. Yeah,
I think it's been an interesting one. I know for me, at least, as I've been able to sample these mission wines that Mike has made the last couple of years, trying to do a little more research and figuring out, could we try a mission from some of these other places? And the list of places where you can get it is actually, it feels kind of short.
It's very short.
And I
very short.
was lucky to be in Spain earlier this year and ended up at a tasting and asked this Spanish winemaker and sommelier if he was familiar with it, and it was like I was speaking another language, but it was a total mystery. So I don't think it's something you're seeing a lot of in mainland Spain either right now. So if it's intriguing to you, follow along, because I think it's kind of a cool thing to be doing here. Yeah.
And I think you'll see more of it. I think there is. We've been for almost 10 years now, 8 years growing it. I think you'll see a little more of it. I think there's more talk about this grape and at least to a degree bringing it back. But I feel like, these are the vines that were on this property in the 1850s and through the 1880s. And I think it's worth bringing back.
Yeah. So stay tuned.
So I think I'm ready for the questions.
Okay, questions. And then we also want to make sure that we address the question of food pairing, because that was something people talked a lot about. So we thought that would be kind of a fun way to wrap things up. If you have some suggestions, as I said earlier, drop them in the chat and we can maybe do a little roundup for everybody's sort of holiday weeks and weekends, and we can put some suggestions on social media or something. But all right, so Jeff Borman, hi Jeff, asked, is there a significant altitude difference between the two blocks? And I'm assuming that you mean block 7 and then 22 and 28, which are next to each other.
Right, so I think no is the short answer. Block 7 is really the highest point elevation-wise in our vineyard, and the top of block 7 is at about 300 feet. Block 22 and 28 are closer to 150 feet. So there is some elevation difference, but I don't think that's an important part of the difference in the wine.
Interesting. So Zinfandel, this is something we didn't really touch on. It is a high alcohol wine often. So this question comes from Pat Budniak, one of our 8-year club members. And she asked, are we, Hendry Winery, considering making any lower alcohol wines? And I assume maybe you mean lower alcohol Zinfandels?
Well, this is it's an interesting topic. I think what Zinfandel does within a cluster and within the wine is sort of combine elements of underripe and overripe. And you may have heard this before. It's almost a cliche, but Zinfandel does ripen very unevenly.
And why is that?
I don't know what the genetic reasons for that are.
Does it have anything to do with the cluster architecture, or you mentioned that you've got unripe and overripe?
Right,
but,
and you even see it starting at veraison. It'll be you see some berries that seem to start much earlier than others. And so when you're picking Zinfandel, maybe 10% of the grapes are what you'd consider overripe, and at least 10% are what you'd consider underripe, and then you've got everything in between. And the grapes that are overripe are often essentially raisins, and a raisin is something that's providing a bunch of sugar but not really any liquid of any kind. So the less ripe grapes are providing a lot of acid but not a lot of sugar. So with Zinfandels, you tend to wind up with wines that are relatively high in sugar and ultimately alcohol, but also relatively high in acid, and it makes a very interesting balance, and that's part of Zinfandel. I think there are people who are sort of nostalgic for lower alcohol Zinfandels, and they're very interesting grape contracts that my grandmother signed, from the 40s and 50s and 60s. And if you read them, there'll be clauses that say, if the grapes are at least 22.5 bricks, then you sort of get the maximum value. And if they're less than 22.5 bricks, you get, if you're from 22.5 to 21.5, you get this value, and below that, and it's hard to imagine, sort of knowing what we know now, it's hard to imagine Zinfandel at that low of bricks level. But
bricks, and that would be the way we measure sugar.
Percent sugar
in the fruit when we go to pick. And so what do you see typically now when we're picking?
Well, I think the biggest reason for that, right now, we spend a lot of time thinning Zinfandel crop levels. We remove second crop. We wind up with less fruit that's more uniformly ripe. And back then, sort of a grape was a grape, and if you could pick it all and it was purple and you put it in the box, then you sort of sold it. So it's not that Zinfandel has changed that much, but to a degree, the care that we put into farming it has changed a lot. So the way we make Zinfandel now, I mean, we could make a Zinfandel that would be 13.5% alcohol, but I'm fairly confident that most people really would not like it. It could be a fairly lean, somewhat bitter, tannic style of wine that might, with enough time, become very nice, but it would not be what you'd expect. So, and the other important point to make, I think, is that alcohol matters. It definitely does, but it can be a much more difficult thing to talk about when you don't really know the answer. So if I think there are wines that can really balance a 16% alcohol level, and there are wines that can be out of balance at 14, right? So
yeah.
And if you don't know what you're tasting, it can be much harder to figure that out than you might think.
Yeah. I would say that that's something that just anecdotally I've seen in the tasting room when we have folks tasting the Zinfandel and the Primitivo too, which can, similarly achieve sort of those higher alcohols, is that people are sometimes surprised to find out what the alcohol level is. And so I think Mike's right that the idea of balance is really, really critical, and sort of how alcohol is, how the whole wine is integrated, right? All the fruit flavors and the acid and the tannin and everything like that. So
another thing that's important, and this is, none of this is in defense or support of extreme ripeness, but alcohol really comes from sugar, and sugar is one of the things that can change extremely rapidly, especially in Zinfandel. So Zinfandel is very prone, and the way we farm here, we don't really have much available water. So you can, and the normal ripening process for us with Zinfandel is that sugar goes up at about 2% a week. But you can have conditions where it goes up 5% in 2 days, if it's dry enough and warm enough. So sugar at the time of picking is not necessarily a great indicator of real ripeness, or at least we should say there are a number of other important measures of ripeness, including flavors and phenolic maturity and acid levels and those things. So
right.
Just focusing on the sugar doesn't tell the whole story either.
Yeah, and that's something, if you guys have been here during harvest, you've probably heard sort of our approach, and it's not unique necessarily to us at all, but when we go out, we'll take samples of fruit from every single block on the property, and we test the sugar level, but we're also testing the pH. George is certainly going through and tasting, we're weighing the berries. So there are lots of different factors that we look at, as Mike said, when we're deciding when we're going to pick. So I love this question. I don't know if it was leading, but I like it for that reason. Is there a best value wine varietal in the Napa wine region? Maybe Zinfandel.
Important about Zinfandel too is that it's a grape that people still really associate with Napa, but it's only about 3% of the grape acreage now. So in terms of what we bottle and sell, it's really our biggest grape. But that's not very typical of Napa. So I think, and this is another aside, but one of my favorite things, what I do here most, maybe as some of you know, is really manage the vineyard. I think I'm a kind of a farming first sort of guy, but one of the best things about Zinfandel is that when you buy a good one, you almost always see the vineyard on the label. And I think it's maybe one of the last grapes we have that's like that. It's not just about brand and label, it's about vineyard and site and growing. And this is why, some of the old vineyards are so important, and people who devote time to producing quality Zinfandel are almost always focused on the vineyards, and that's a good thing about it. So yes, Zinfandel is rare in Napa 1, and I think it's definitely a much better wine, better value than a lot of the other wines you'll see. It's also I think one of the things that's true about Zinfandel is that if we did do more blind tastings, if people sat down without knowing what was in front of them and bought what they liked, I think we'd have a lot more Zinfandel. It's a grape that tends to sort of hit a lot of points that are appealing to a wide range of people.
And foods, I think. So when we get to that, that's actually one of my favorite things that Mike says about Zinfandel is that if people just picked it straight out of a blind lineup, that we'd probably be drinking more of that. So I think that actually is a really nice tangent into another question that comes up a lot with Zinfandel is we tend to see a lot of old vine Zinfandel on labels more than maybe with other grape varieties like Cabernet and Merlot. And so why is that, and are they necessarily better?
So for the reasons we talked about earlier, I mean, between 1880 and the early 1900s, I think really the vast majority of plantings were Zinfandel, which is why when you talk about really old vineyards in California, you're usually talking about Zinfandel. I love old vineyards. I think they are really pretty incredible. The way that it's a big topic, and the question that I like to ask really, and people seem to think that old vineyards are wonderful, and I tend to agree with them. The question I like to ask is, do you think the vineyard is good because it's old, or do you think it's old because it's good? And by that I mean only if you consistently get something really good from a vineyard does it ever get to be old. So really, at the end of the day, the hardest thing to do is to say exactly why a wine tastes the way it does. But many of these old vineyards that are left have a reputation as producing excellent wine, and they've done it for a long time, which is how they got to be old. So I also work with one of the oldest Zinfandel vineyards in Napa. My wife's uncle and also Megan's uncle owns the Moore Vineyard in Napa, which was planted in 1905, and it's a field blended, dry farmed vineyard that's it's fun to look at. It's kind of an heirloom, but it has a track record for making wonderful wines.
So do you have a favorite Hendry Zinfandel vintage? Elizabeth Ransom would like to know.
Oh, I mean, I have several. I've enjoyed going back. I mean, some of the early to mid 90s Block 7 Zinfandels, I've liked them all along, and I still like them. The 1999 Block 28, which was one of the first vintages from that block, is still fantastic. 2004, 2001, or 2007 are years that I like a lot. So, I mean, I have several.
That kind of mirrors what we tasted last week with the red blend. Was we had the 01 and the 04 was really good, and
yeah, and that is when I mentioned that I sort of resist getting into the good vintage, bad vintage discussion. I still, despite myself, find myself having some years where I really like a fairly broad spectrum of our wines.
Yeah. Well, I think the thing about the good vintage, bad vintage is that there are just so many factors and varieties. Like, there are so many grapes out there, and, one year could be great for something and maybe not for something else. Yeah. So to make a sweeping statement, I feel like that feels really hard. Yeah. So widening the scope a little bit, are there other Zinfandel producers, I guess here in Napa or even more broadly, that we like and respect? And I would say a lot, for sure. Yeah. I think one that immediately comes to mind when you reference the Moore Vineyard is that some of that fruit goes to Robert Bialy. They make a lot of really wonderful Zinfandels from all over Napa and Sonoma. So it's kind of fun to see what they're doing over there.
I think there are a number of wineries, and you probably know them too, who have really taken and preserved some of these Zinfandel vineyards, who've made them household names, and that's sort of a movement that's taken time and effort. Right. And wineries like Ridge, like wineries like Turley, wineries like Bialy, certainly within Napa. We've got a lot of respect for Storybook Mountain in Napa. It's the people at Bedrock do a lot of the same stuff. There are a lot of people to look up to in Zinfandel. There's a lot of great stuff in Lodi, honestly. Almost 40% of the Zinfandel in California is in Lodi now. There are a bunch of fantastic old vineyards there too.
Right. Because if you think about that history of these old vineyards being planted to Zinfandel, and then when something new and hot comes along in Napa like Cabernet and people switched over, other folks in other areas weren't benefiting from the Napa Valley Cabernet boom really in the same way, so they didn't have any real reason to change if they had a great product, right? And so for them, just keeping those vineyards made sense, and now it's, I think, kind of paying dividends in some ways.
Well, I think when you consider that the average prices of Zinfandel here are $4,000 a ton and the average prices of Cabernet are $7,000 a ton, it's still a labor of love for the people who keep it going.
Do it here, What are the do you know in terms of Zin prices elsewhere in the state? Is it as much of a labor of love elsewhere, or can it be just as an economical decision in other parts of California? It's a really detailed
I don't know the answer. I suspect that on an average basis, Napa Zinfandel values are some of the highest. I do know, I'm going back several years now, but between Napa Valley average and California-wide average, there was a factor of 5 essentially in average grape prices.
All grapes.
Although there are also much lower crop levels, which is another factor too. So I can answer that at another one, but it would take a little research.
That was a shot in the dark that just came into my head, so I thought I'd try. But so we touched on this briefly a minute ago, but how long can we age Zinfandel, and should we? Those 01 and 04 Zins that you were drinking, that wasn't that long ago, right?
Right. No, so you, and how long should you is that's a complicated question, and it depends on you. And I think there's no doubt that some of these Zinfandels age very well. I think there are some people whose palates tend toward liking younger style of wines. And if what you really like is the fresh fruit side of it, then drink them younger. But they can maintain a very nice balance and complexity and range. They become more delicate. They can become sort of very soft. Our neighbor Ron Stradiato, I think right now, is drinking a bottle of 1997 Block 7 wine, and I'd be interested to hear how he's enjoying that. But I find people who tend to like older wines, and I find some who tend to not like them. And if you find a Zinfandel that has a nice structure and complexity and range and balance, but some good tannins and density, maybe buy a case or buy 6 bottles and drink it over 5 or 6 years or 10 years. Drink a bottle every 6 months, or check it out, and you'll start to form these opinions. But don't write Zinfandel off as something that doesn't age well, because I promise you that is not true. It can age extremely well.
And I think that one question sometimes people have about, have we waited too long? There's really only one way of knowing, right? And you're not going to hurt yourself by trying. So I think it's always worth, if you have some questions, to give it a shot, right? And it's not only about what your own personal preferences are too, but how it's been stored. If it's been standing up by your stove, maybe it has a higher chance of being past its prime than if it had been laying down on its side in a dark closet or something like that. But so the storage piece, of course, comes into it as well. All right, Ange, do we have some other questions there, or should we jump into some food pairings? So lots of questions every week, I think, about food pairings. This week in particular, some people wrote in and said, any suggestions for Easter or Passover? Generally, I think, to me, as Mike said, Zin, it can balance some things like a lot of grapefruit and alcohol and acid. So I think it makes a really flexible pairing wine. I like it with a lot of different things. So my go-to is always sort of roasted and grilled meats. I think that's really tasty. You throw something on the grill, especially in the summertime, that can be really nice. I think lamb, we touched on lamb last week as well too. So a couple of people had suggested that as something that they were going to be drinking or eating this week with some Zinfandel.
There are 2 meals that stick out in my mind as amazing pairings with Block 28. And one was a beef short rib that had a mix of herbs and spices, including some star anise in it, and a thick dark sauce that was really great. And the other one was venison with morel mushrooms, was incredible with Block 28. Block 7 and 22, historically, to me, things like pork tenderloin, I've really enjoyed with that wine, either with some sort of herby crust or something with a little sweetness and a glaze. Is really, really good.
Yeah, people have talked about barbecue too. You know, it often has, especially sort of traditional barbecue, like a little sweetness to it. Anything sort of with those herbs, you know, there is some spice to Zinfandel, and I think that's particularly true, at least historically, it has been in our 7 and 22. So things with, you know, a nice, as you said, an herb crust or some really nice herbs in there can be good, like a chili. So we've been talking a lot about meat, but if you're not a meat eater, I think you can still drink Zinfandel with plenty of things, like a nice hearty, you know, bean chili or something like that. Or, you know, I love roasted vegetables, eggplant, tomatoes, you know, those often get those kind of caramelized sort of sweet notes as well. I think that can be really tasty. You know, sort of heartier cheeses too. I think if you're having like a cheese board, something like Parmesan or Manchego can be kind of nice because they're not too light and delicate, and they're not going to get overwhelmed necessarily. So that can be a good one. Yeah.
I'm getting hungry.
I know. So I think that means, you know, it's time for us to sign off here. And we thank you again so much for joining us. And as George said, for your support and calls and emails. And it's kept Angela very, very busy. So we really appreciate it. And, you know, next week we're going to talk about climate in Napa and Burgundian wines, so Pinot and Chardonnay. So tune in for that. That should be fun as well. And in the meantime, again, do send us other questions. There were a couple of things that we didn't get to, and we'll definitely follow up with people individually. So keep those coming on social media and everything, and we'll do our best to get back to you guys and see you in a week, I guess.
Cheers.
Bye.